is Facebook and this collection of companies more powerful than government?
It's almost like the Star Wars trilogy. It's like Bitcoin was the New Hope, Facebook's the Empire Strikes Back, and then we'll see who's the Return of the Jedi.
That's right.
This is episode 57, and we're going to discuss Facebook's entrance into cryptocurrency with two of our favorite all-time guests, Tegan Klein from episode 41.
Facebook usage is down. They've maxed out all of the social and behavioral data that they can collect, and this is a way to keep Facebook alive. This kind of goes against everything that Bitcoin stands for.
Joined by Miko Matsumura, Coloring Crypto's guest on episode 12, amongst a bunch of others.
Bitcoin doesn't care. Like, what I mean to say is, like, it isn't threatened, it isn't bothered, because it's going to win regardless.
Coloring Crypto.
We've got a lively, fun, and informative discussion up ahead for you here. And it's not just because we got the Star Wars metaphors and Game of Thrones metaphors coming up, but I can't think of two more honest and accessible guests that I'd rather discuss Facebook and Bitcoin with. Miko had just landed in France. It's not easy to find a spot to record a podcast at an airport, and Tegan initiated this entire thing, so thank you to both of you for that. You can find Miko on the web at miko.com. You can find Tegan on Twitter, The Klein Venture, and all this is in the show notes. Reach me at Gabe Colors on Twitter. Find it all on our website, coloringcrypto.com. And for you obsessed podcast listeners, let's drop our sponsor appreciation with a beat. First, the Benja Commerce Network. They deliver shoppable media experiences in social media feeds and online display advertising. Find out more about the future of commerce at benja.co. Second is Hidoku Labs. Hue No Color. Hidoku's on the App Store. You can sign up now at hidoku.com to beta test their new app, Hidoku Pix. All right, Facebook Libra, Facebook Coin. Quick summary. This is huge. It most likely helps to further crypto, but keep an eye on these guys. Pay attention because Facebook has already showed us clearly who they are. All right, let's get Miko and Tegan on here. Tegan, welcome.
Thank you.
And Miko, do you want to start and just give us a quick overview of what this is?
Yeah, so, the best way to describe it is that, Facebook is participating in the open source money movement. They've developed essentially you could loosely call it blockchain. Jameson Lopp says it's not a blockchain, but they're really, effectively inspired by blockchain technology to develop, a cryptographic asset, right? And based on open source software. And so the thing that I think is novel about this is that there's a pretty muscular association presently of 28 organizations. And, that's, I think, a new wrinkle. But I think the other twist to the tail is, of course, that we know that Facebook, has 2.5 billion monthly active users. So, I think that that's really the thing that is causing a lot of people to take notice and to have discussions and, really hoping to have a really interesting one today.
How long have you known this was coming, and what have been some initial responses out there, both your own and kind of like what the the community has been saying?
I'm happy to kind of start with the way I would respond to it. So this has been a long drum roll. Like I would say that the first initial inkling, like every single year, Mark Zuckerberg actually announces his kind of like beginning of the year, New Year's ambitions, and really at the beginning of last year, his mood was kind of this idea of, I really need to fix Facebook, right? I need to fix it, right? Because the mood was really like everyone's angry at Facebook. There's a lot of concerns about user privacy. There's concerns about like just a variety of things, things like fake news and concerns about all kinds of things, right? So, he'd been pulled in front of a bunch of, government authorities. So he really had this big mood of, I'm going to fix Facebook. And, in that annual letter, he basically declared that he was going to be looking into blockchain technologies, right? And that was a serious thing, And so that was, I think, my first inkling, right, that he was really doing this, because, you generally have to take these things pretty seriously when he says he's going to, do something. And then the thing that started happening is we started seeing, like, even, bigger clues, right? Like, for example, the vice president of Facebook Messenger, he ended up, stepping down. He ended up stepping down from the board of Coinbase, right? So, this is David Marcus, who used to be the president of PayPal, and then he became VP of messaging products for Facebook. So now here's the guy who's supposed to run Messenger, and he was sitting on the board of Coinbase. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is David Marcus doing sitting on the board of Coinbase? And then the next thing you have to ask yourself is, what is David Marcus doing stepping off of the board of Coinbase, right? And I think we could easily see, for example, if you connect the dots, you could think about, like, why did Eric Schmidt step off the board of Apple, right? And you could see that, okay, well, Eric Schmidt stepping off the board of Apple could signify that they were launching a competitor to the iPhone, which was Android, right? So, why is David Marcus stepping off the board of Coinbase? Conflict of interest. So, maybe Facebook is doing something, right? So, so the writing has been on the wall for quite a while. And, if you've been in the mood of connect the dots, you really will be able to anticipate this.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when Mark announced that he was interested in getting into the blockchain space. I think, Facebook usage is down. They've maxed out all of the social and behavioral data that they can collect. And this is a way to keep Facebook alive. And if you look at Facebook's business model, it currently relies heavily around collecting and monetizing that social data. So now this gives them a way to expand that to financial data, giving them a 360 view of our behaviors, our friends, and now who we send money to and when. And I think it's important to mention a few other facts about Facebook Coin in addition to what Miko mentioned.
I might be wrong, but I'm guessing we are going, which is going to be a really, I think, super engaging topic. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that people listening kind of understand the problem Facebook is trying to solve. And if I'll just quickly try to summarize that, and you guys see if I have it right. And then let's get into, like, the positives and negatives. But what I'm reading from them is, there's still, a third of the world that's not able to access banks and financial services. And they're, whether it's a cryptocurrency, by definition, we'll get into that, but it's certainly a way of moving money digitally that they're providing. And in theory, it's going to be, low cost or no cost for transaction fees, really empowering people around the world with this, quote, global digital currency.
Yeah, I mean, if you do consult with the Libra white paper, that's really essentially the crux of the discussion, right? Which is that their vision is really related to providing access to financial services, and that it really is about, in their mood, it's really about kind of effectively increasing or expanding access to financial services, and so it kind of fits the mood of, banking the unbanked. So, obviously that's their vision and the way they express or articulate that. But, just kind of rooting back to kind of some of the earlier sentiments around this, it's quite a robust piece of effort, even in the just pure sense of business development, of getting the commitment of, 28 organizations to each pony up $10 million US, and not to mention the development of a new programming language called Move, and obviously to develop like a new, it isn't a completely novel consensus, but it's, quite a lot of technology, and in fact, the testnet reference implementation of this, let's just call it a blockchain. So, I think that you can't have done all these things without, some amount of information leaks, unless you're maybe Apple. under Steve Jobs. But like, so I think that, the information's been trickling out that this has been underway. And, there's even such simple things as like people are looking at the employment boards at Facebook and noticing that Facebook is sure hiring a lot of blockchain engineers and technical talent. So, that starts to become pretty clear and obvious as well. So, yeah, so this thing has definitely been a big, long drum roll. And, the drum roll continues, right? Like, we're really not going to see a mainnet until 2020. So, it's not something that's already been, achieved. But at the same time, like, the amount of progress that they have made is making it pretty clear that, unless there's some kind of a regulatory hurdle, that they're going to do it.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. So Tegan, what's the relevance of that Facebook is the one doing this?
I think the relevance is that, one, they have that reach, so that of the 2.3 billion users, and that allowed a lot of these companies to kind of get behind them. And though a lot of those companies admit that they don't necessarily trust Facebook, they say that they do trust the technology. But I think that there's a large factor in this, which is the Calibra wallet app that Facebook will use to and that is a closed source application that lives inside inside Facebook. And that's where all of that data will be collected. So you do have to trust Facebook in order to use this technology and to use the Libra coin.
It's funny. You guys are on Facebook a lot more than I am. I've intentionally tried to delete the app from my phone, and so we were using Facebook Messenger to kind of coordinate this meeting. And I'm like, I don't check Facebook. I try not to because I just get distracted into Facebook's world. But and so I was like, what should I do for background reading? And Miko's like, obviously read the white paper, And so I opened it up, and like you say, it's robust. So I read the white paper, but that's just the top line, and every section's got deeper places to go. They've taken the best of everything and put it all together, and it's so much they can kind of like, they numbed me out to totally getting it, like what's open source, what's closed source, even how the is it a blockchain, is it not a blockchain? Can you guys just kind of talk about some of those things? I'm not sure what we even call those.
Yeah, I can dive into that. So first, I think it's important to point out that it is a permissioned blockchain, meaning that it is private. So only select individuals are allowed to participate. It's also centralized. In order to operate a node, you have to pay $10 million, and they're seeking 100 nodes. So they're seeking $1 billion with 100 essentially wealthy gatekeepers. Also, I do want to say that in regards to the permission fact, they do say that they have goals to move to a permissionless blockchain down the line. But I think that's years out. Also, there are two tokens. There's the stable coin, which is the Libra coin, and then there's also a security token. And the only way to buy that Libra security token is through a private placement, which will be circulated to those Libra Association members. So what I understand, it's those individuals that have paid that $10 million price tag to get in.
And for those of us in this community, I think there's a lot of flags there where we're like, but just like to drill that down into like an everyday experience and how that might have impacts. What's the problem with having, making it, charging $10 million to own a node, and what are like the without just assuming it just sounds bad, what's the actual impact of that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I want to say, I think this is the next step towards that financial revolution, and it is kind of pushing us in the right direction. But it's important in that same breath to say, to acknowledge the risks and tell people about the risks. And the risks are that your data is being collected. It likely is going to be monetized. And we've seen how reckless Facebook has been in the past with the Cambridge Analytica scandal with our data. So now that they have a 360 view of our data, and they're getting data, the financial data of people in impoverished nations, which has probably never been collected before. So it's very scarce data. I think that, that could have a ripple effect. And I also want to say, this kind of goes against everything that Bitcoin stands for. Bitcoin, was created to give people financial freedom. It's open sourced. It's decentralized, also permissionless, which means anyone can join the network, not just people with, $10 million. And you don't have to trust anyone with Bitcoin. You don't have to trust governments or companies or individuals. And I would say that, Facebook coin is almost the opposite of that.
So, to me, like what you've said is like a mouthful in the sense that like it's just this big mass of different kinds of things that are mixed kind of allegations and mixed kind of like positions. It's a lot, right? So you're saying a lot here, right? But what I would like to do is kind of like maybe just peel back to kind of some of these sub points, right? Because my thing that's really interesting is, my entire kind of approach and thesis to this space is what I call open source money, right? And so what I'm seeing here is I'm seeing a company that has traditionally had contributions to the open source community and open source software. Like if you look at something like the React framework, like that's probably the most popular JavaScript framework it is. And like, and it's contributed by Facebook, and Facebook is written in React. So like it's, that's a pretty nice contribution that they made to open source software, right? And so to me, like when I look at what they're doing, like I think is fundamentally important that to understand from my perspective is that like, if you represent open source money as something like Bitcoin, right? Like Bitcoin doesn't care. Like what I mean to say is like it isn't threatened, it isn't bothered because it's going to win regardless, right? So my point is this: is that even if Facebook were to behave in all of these ways that you describe, I don't think it's material. Like what I mean by I don't think it's material is I think it's thanks for the 2.5 billion monthly active users, and then why don't you compete against free software? Because so to me, like my response is kind of addressing it on multiple layers, right? Which to me is kind of like the first layer, though. What I'd like to address is that you're really talking about like drawing a straight line between the past behavior of Facebook and the future behavior of Facebook, when in fact, like Mark Zuckerberg has said that he's going to rebuild Facebook in a way that respects privacy. Now, I think your instant reaction is that's a lie.
Well,
right?
Then open source Libra wallet. Why is he going to close source it if that's true?
Well, the bottom line is that the wallet doesn't really matter. And the reason why I say the wallet doesn't matter is that, the wallet's going to be sort of part of the implementation that they're going to deliver with something like Facebook Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp, right? And so the fact that they would close source a wallet implementation that's Facebook's business, right? In other words, like let Facebook do whatever it wants, right? Now, they've been clever enough to establish this organization of Libra, and so the question becomes like, I think David Marcus said himself, he was like, look, like if you don't like our implementation, just use another implementation, right? Because, if you go to the Libra GitHub repository, you'll see that making a wallet on top of this thing is going to be really easy. So, I think that there's going to be, like, for example, Evercoin, which is an exchange that and wallet that I work with, has already announced that they're planning to support the Libra token in the Evercoin wallet, right? So if you don't like Facebook wallet, you could use the Evercoin wallet, or you could use another wallet. So my point is that if a vendor has a closed source implementation that rests on an open source, like, platform, like that's fine.
I'm curious if for people that are reading, I feel like this is gonna be like the Mueller report a little bit, where all the talk about it is by most people who haven't actually read the whole thing. I guess it's the Maya Angelou quote of trust me the first time I tell you who I am. Like Facebook has told us who they are, and they have just consistently lied. And I hear what you're saying, Miko, is like, well, that's okay. Like everything that's out there is still out there, and we can all access it. But are there like hidden back doors or ways that Facebook could like pull the rug out from under this whole thing? For example, what happens if they deplatform you? Is there a way they could do what PayPal does, and suddenly you've got your money in Libra, and for whatever reason you just a terrorist phone called you, and now suddenly the U.S. government is forcing them to freeze your account? Like, could they do that?
To me,
a mouthful.
I think so. No, I think that what you're purporting is a significant concern, and to me, I think that's really the purpose of things like the Apache 2 license, which allows you to kind of understand exactly what the nature of the platform is. And to me, like, I think if they put a backdoor into the platform, then I think developers would look at it and be like, what the hell is that? And so to me, like, I don't think it's feasible for them to try to go forward in the open source community with a backdoor like that. Now, obviously, I haven't done an extensive enough analysis of their testnet and their initial code, but it'd be my assumption that some bloggers and, like Jameson Lopp has studied the code. There's been a number of pretty credible open source developers that have, and have critically, studied the code, that have said things like it's not a blockchain, and it's not decentralized. And I think those are pretty legitimate things, but nobody has said like, oh, there's a deplatforming backdoor, or there's not mechanics like that have been thus far commented on. So, the thing that's amazing and wonderful about open source software is that, everyone who's able to can read it and say whatever they want about it, and obviously if they say things that are untrue, then other people just show them up and say, well, that's not actually what it says. And so ultimately the internet will be able to decide, what the is. And I think that because it's all happening kind of out in the open, that makes it a lot harder for them to pull the kind of traditionally nefarious things, right? So to me, like, the thing that we got from Mark Zuckerberg when he made the announcement about, privacy, this predated actually the announcement of Libra. He said, hey, we're rebuilding Facebook in a way that respects privacy, right? Now, here's the amazing thing, right, which is that you could have one of two reactions to that, right? Like, one of the reactions, which is probably the more sensible reaction, is to just instantly dismiss it and say that's obviously a lie, right? You could make a middle ground argument and say it's not a lie that he intends to, but that he won't be able to succeed at doing that. That's the second place you could go. But I think the third place you could go is you could say, I see, they're making a bank, right? Mm-hmm. So the only way that you could make a Facebook that respects privacy is if you actually wean the organization from advertising revenue by generating some kind of much more significant revenue, like, for example, financial services, right? So, if you really kind of like read between the lines, like, to me, when I read between the lines, what I see is Mark Zuckerberg, who's really actually been beat up like hell. Like, he's really, really beat up person. And not only has he been kind of accused of every single wrongdoing, but he's, in a way, like, his optimism and his excitement about Facebook and its technology, and even social media as a kind of way to advance, the cause of interconnecting humanity, has all been kind of like rubbish by everyone. And in a way, I think that he's wanting to do something, Now, obviously, he's wanting to make as much money for himself and Facebook as possible, which I don't begrudge. But, if you actually kind of watch this character, it's not inconsistent to imagine that he would want to reinvent this organization around different principles. And the other way of reading this, too, is to look at this as this notion that he, if he wants to reinvent this thing, like, is he even able to do such a thing? And the thing that I think is interesting about Facebook is that, similar to structures that emerged around Google, and Alphabet, like, Mark Zuckerberg has a supernumerary voting capacity, right? And so even though a bunch of shareholders at Facebook are already making a protest vote and asking for his removal, because of his supernumerary voting position they're really unable to make him do that. So the bottom line is does he have the power to do that? Yes, he does. And would he have the power to do that even if it had a material effect on Facebook's short-term revenues? Yes, yeah, he would be able to do that. So to me, like, he has the power to do it. He has the motivation to do it. And to me, I say let's watch and see if he does it. Right? I'm not. I'm not saying that he's going to be successful, and I'm not saying that he's has pure intentions. I'm really just saying let's see what he does.
It's so tempting to just do a whole psychoanalysis of Mark Zuckerberg, but we're not going to go there. But it is tempting. So Tegan, from what Miko's saying, and it's way more complex than this, but like generally, you're sounding skeptical.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think it's going to be a net positive for the blockchain space. I would argue that it's not blockchain technology, but it's moving in the right direction. I am simply just asking that we educate people, the millions, if not billions, of people that are going to come into the crypto space because of this, about the potential risks and about why we believe in Bitcoin and why Facebook Coin kind of goes against a lot of the values that Bitcoin stands for.
You're not the only one saying Facebook Coin instead of Libra. Do you think that'll be a branding issue for them forever?
So I say Facebook Coin because there are two coins. It's not just Libra. It's also that security investment. So that's the reason I say Facebook Coin instead.
Explain that for listeners, the difference.
Yeah, so there's two tokens. There's the stable coin, which is the Libra coin, which is what these billions of people will be able to access. And then there's that security token that I mentioned, which is like the Libra investment token, that only those individuals that have paid that price tag, the Libra Association members, will be able to access and earn interest.
Coloring Crypto.
Quick break to thank our sponsors, the Benja Commerce Network. Find out more about the future of commerce at benja.co, and also to Hudoku Labs. Go to Hudoku, HUEDOKU.com. And you can always reach me. This is Gabe Colors, at Gabe Colors on Coloring Crypto. Thanks for listening. Back to the program with Miko Matsumura and Tegan Klein on Facebook Libra. Do you want to just explain again for listeners that the stable coin and the basket and kind of their why they're doing that, and then how that kind of works?
Well, I mean, if you think about the stable coin, it's really just kind of a traditional central banking construct, right? And so, they're really just looking at holding a basket of these currencies, and I think that the notion becomes that holders of the so-called security token are actually basically accessing interest that comes out of the holdings of this, stable basket of currencies. So, I think that's kind of the broader mindset, and I think it's certainly not an uncommon sort of two-token structure.
I mean, when I read that section, this is one of the areas I got numbed over, where I just felt like the tone of voice in the white paper was, this will be so unbiased, and it will all be dedicated to being stable. It'll be run by this kind of like this trust, this group. They'll be every Libra coin that is purchased will have a fiat match within the world based on some not fixed to any pegged to any single country's money, but kind of this basket, this collection, and but still there's human beings running that, and they've got their own networks and power biases and all these things. And so that was one of those like things of like, wait a minute, like that sounds like bullshit. Like that's going to be totally susceptible to getting whatever, making the rich richer, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, here's my mood, right? My mood is that like it very well could be, right? But the way that I reason about this is that like Facebook is contributing software on GitHub into open source. It's pretty neat, right? Like if you look at what they've contributed, like if you look at the move programming language, and it's sort of Byzantine fault tolerant. They're calling it like a both. They actually do call it a blockchain, and they also call it a database. But they have obviously replication protocol, like BFT consensus. So they have a lot of the kind of things that you'd expect to see, if you did want to call it a blockchain. But I guess to me, the thing that I think is just always fundamentally true of like open source is that open source is a matrix that competes for consent, right? And so the thing about it is that, what they've done is they've kind of blended a kind of muscular consortium, which is really kind of like an extension of typical centralized power, right? But the governance mechanism is more of a consortium governance mechanism where Facebook controls 1/28 of the governance and eventually 1/100th of the governance of this foundation, right? And then the notion becomes like, there's obviously a certain amount of centralization that comes with that kind of a structure, but at the end of the day, the thing that I think it has to be kind of like assumed is that like, they're entering a marketplace where ideas and implementations and projects compete for consent, right? So the thing that is interesting about this is that there's a muscular organization there, but like when you think about it from a pure open source software perspective, like if you could always fork the code. You could create your own organization. Now, obviously, like you could imagine the use cases they're thinking about where you check out at the store and instead of using Visa or MasterCard, you're using Libra, or if you, instead of using money to pay Uber or Lyft, you're just using Libra, and these are just some of the members of this kind of broader organization. So to me, like, yeah, there's a lot of power inherent in the kind of organization that they built around this thing, and again, the organization is separate from Facebook, but it's also separate from the open source project, right? So, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that, you could fork the code base, but the organization of all these different, Uber and Lyft and MasterCard and Visa don't come along with your branch, right? So to me, the thing that I think is really intriguing about this whole game and the way it's going to turn out, though, is that, they're really just participating in the story arc of their own commoditization, right? So, at the end of the day, like, they're adding a huge burst of users and energy and validation into this space, right? And so they're going to create a universe where people become really used to using open source money, right? So it's like, well, thanks for that, right? And then at that point, you're going to find that all of a sudden there's going to be like a Linux type of thing going on, where all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, Microsoft is going to be the emperor of the world and they're going to kill everyone. And, we went through that. Microsoft is no longer trying to eat the world and kill everyone. They're just trying to like participate in the internet, right? Because, Microsoft was not able to monopolize and dominate the internet and everything else. And I don't think Facebook will be able to do that either. So that's my move.
So
yeah,
you mentioned, like Uber, Visa, MasterCard, Lyft. Those guys are all in that 28 member consortium right now. Were you guys struck at all by who was not on there? And I'm kind of thinking, like, I read through that and I was like, if Goldman Sachs is on here, I'm gonna, I'm gonna go crazy. But they're not. There's those. Like, what are your thoughts about who got on there, why, and who's not in that group right now?
Yeah. So it's super interesting, right? So for example, like if you look at like marketplaces, even like eBay is on there, Spotify is on there, this Bookings Holdings, which is like travel, like the pretty popular travel websites are on there. So if you look, like it's extremely muscular, and in fact, one of the criteria that they proposed is that these members are they have access to 20 million or more users apiece. They really created a more flexible approach where 2 out of the 3 criteria that they hold could allow entrance. So, for example, if you look at organizations like Andreessen Horowitz, like Andreessen Horowitz doesn't really have end users. They have like LPs, I think is the closest thing they have to an end user, and they don't have 20 million LPs, right? So the point is that not every single organization fits every single criteria. But I think when you're saying like who's not a part of this thing, one of the things that was a super interesting tweet that Ben Horowitz made, I think this morning, is he said something like, other major technology companies are also working on cryptocurrency projects, right? And first of all, like, it's super interesting for him to say so. And the second of all, if they are, Ben Horowitz would know about it, And so to me, like, when I hear him say something like that on Twitter, I'm going to take it at face value, right? So, when you think about who's not on this, it's like, yeah, Apple is not on this, right? Like, Google is not on this. Microsoft is not on this, right? So when you look at who's not on this, it's like, yeah, like the natural enemies of Facebook are not on this, right? So the question then becomes, what are they going to do? And I think my whole point is what they're going to do is they're going to form the Rebel Alliance is what they're going to do, right? They're going to get together with everyone else that's left behind. And they're going to get together with like IBM, and they're going to get together with every single one that's not part of this thing. And obviously Facebook's done an awesome job wrapping up certain markets, right? Like, for example, if you look at like Visa and MasterCard, like, who's like, who's Microsoft going to get, or who's Apple going to get? Because, those are the ones that you should get, right? Maybe those are the guys that are going to get banks, right? So maybe they're going to get Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, because they're going to get together, right? So the point that I would make with the history of open source software is that there's always a monopolist and there's always kind of a rebel alliance. But the thing that I think is really exciting about what's happening here is that the monopolist has already opened with open source software, right? So the thing that's really interesting is traditionally the monopolist has been proprietary. So, I feel like we're already like half a foot into the future and half a foot into kind of a better future, because ultimately the open source component is the thing that commoditizes, it lowers the cost of transactions, and it lowers the cost of innovation, right? So to me, like, yeah, like, I think Ben Horowitz has a really interesting comment, right? Which is, watch the space, right? Like, this is not the end of the story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like the Star Wars trilogy. It's like Bitcoin was the New Hope, Facebook's the Empire Strikes Back, and then we'll see who's the Return of the Jedi.
Right. Google has a tremendous tradition contributing to open source. Apple a lot less so. Apple is much more kind of been a proprietary player. Obviously, Apple has made tremendous contributions to open source, but like less than Google. And Google's made more than almost anyone, right? And so, who knows? Who's and to me, like, if you think about the Revenge of the Nerds, like, this game is going to be like cracked to like the Google people. Like, they're not going to be able to stay away from this thing. So I think they're probably going to lead the charge, and I think that they may end up collaborating with kind of almost like natural enemies, right? Because the thing that happened with like Java versus Microsoft is you ended up with like really weird alliances, like IBM and Oracle getting together. It's kind of like, well, doesn't Oracle have a DB2 database, and don't they compete with Oracle, and aren't they all enemies? And it's like, no, because they all want to fight Microsoft, right? So that was what happened, 25 years ago in the history of like the Java technology, which is sort of open source. But, I think the natural evolution of this becomes that competition, provides a certain measure of decentralization. But I think at the end of the day, like, open source is kind of the thing that you just can't bet against, right? Like, open source is going to commoditize everything, lower the cost of everything. And actually, the thing that ultimately wins is that these are all competing on the basis of consent, right? And so the point is that if you can get people to consent, and like, that's who wins, So I think there are going to be a cosmological number of people that will consent to use Facebook and Libra, and I can imagine myself using it, because I can imagine that it'd be pretty darn convenient. Right? I could just cruise around and wave my phone at things, and they open, or they make me coffee, or whatever the heck they do, drive me to my destination, right? So I'm all for that. Let's go ahead and start creating that world, right? But, I guarantee you that like open source never sleeps, right? So like, as soon as it becomes like a real thing, then there's going to be a version of that that's a little maybe less commercial and maybe a little bit more open and maybe a little bit less controllable. And so that'll become a real interesting challenge, right? And if you have centralized gatekeepers that are trying to take a tax, then it will be an externality in an open source version that doesn't take a tax. So I think they've really thrown down the competitive gauntlet by launching this as open source. And I think that it's really going to be a race of monetization. So, it's really amazing. I think they're really kind of we're watching the hollowing out happening right now in front of our eyes. And this is really just the first, the genie's out of the bottle.
I appreciate your optimism, Miko.
I'm only optimistic because I've been watching open source software for the past 30 years. And I can tell you that open source software is bigger than anything. It's bigger than Facebook, certainly. It's bigger than any of the 28 or all of the 28 companies added together that joined Facebook. So, open source software is really relentless. Now, will it take time? Yes. I mean, it took open source software 30 years to basically dominate enterprise software, but it has, right? So, now open source software has dominated enterprise software, so it's kind of like, all right, now on to the next, right? Like what other infrastructure can open source dominate? And, the next one is open source money and the formation of a new internet, right? So we're rebuilding the internet on the basis of open source money, which is kind of this notion of blockchain-based digital scarcity. So, I think that's interesting. And, the reason why I'm kind of optimistic is that, it's totally like Star Wars. Like, there's going to be a whole bunch of movies, right? But, you think the good guys aren't going to win?
I'm thinking of the debates that are happening out there, kind of on Twitter that I'm seeing, where people are like, it's not even really a cryptocurrency, it's digital money, but it's not decentralized. The rollout of this, I think, it's incredibly well thought through, and like they've covered every single touch point, and like you said, this power consortium. I think I would have no problem saying Facebook is pretty much, whether it's Zuckerberg's bad intent or just his ignorance. I'd say more on ignorance. He just doesn't get it that people are going to leverage his tools for evil, and he's certainly an incredible capitalist, and he's done a great job monetizing and making products that make money. But I just wouldn't trust that guy to, with building the global financial bank of the world. So clearly, we're not trying to make any final conclusions on this, but kind of open up the questions. And so I guess I'd like to kind of not wrap this up, but begin to wrap it up with what should we be paying attention to? Maybe Tegan, what are some of the questions that you have, and where are you going to kind of look to have those conversations and sort of figure that out for your own self?
Yeah, I guess I would just, I hope that people kind of put pressure on them to kind of open source Calibra, make it permissionless, and also kind of look at our freedoms and maybe are our freedoms being taken away by big, businesses and governments kind of getting into a partnership. We separated church and state, and I think it's important that we kind of separate money and state, and I almost feel like this is moving away from that.
Separating money and state, meaning and this is an example of big corporations. Like
central banks. You look at central banks and how much they control, and maybe, Facebook Coin will put pressure, or Libra Coin will put pressure on, these central banks in places with high inflation, or since it is centralized, it'll be easy to kind of ban in those areas. We'll see.
How about you, Miko?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the thing that I think gets me excited is that, it's really, I'm in the mood of who's in service, right? Because, the central theme of my entire investment thesis around open source money, and by the way, it's open source software at the bottom, open source data above that, and then open source money, and then open source capital markets, right? So it's really this entire full stack of financial services. And when I say open source capital markets, you may want to even create a sub-layer underneath that, which is essentially kind of what is currently called DeFi or decentralized finance, which is just basically programmable financial instruments of any derivative or base asset. So it's really a fascinating emergence, right? So to me, like when someone like a Facebook or a Libra consortium kind of comes up with ways to contribute to this discourse, like it's really happening in the rules of the open source world, right? And it's not happening in the rules of the conventional world, right? So that's the thing that I think we need to kind of like understand. So the thing that I think is kind of fascinating is that, like, yeah, I mean, people can kind of pressure Facebook and they can kind of lobby Facebook and this and that, and I think that in a way, like, the biggest pressure Facebook will encounter will be alternatives, right? And so, to me, if like Google or Microsoft come together, yeah, maybe they team up, right? Because like maybe they realize that, like, Uber, Lyft, MasterCard, Visa is kind of like a monopoly, so now they may need to attack it from a different angle. Maybe they pick up like a bunch of banks, or who knows what they're going to do. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, we're gonna see this thing kind of really play out very organically, and I think that the thing that's, to me, like, yes, like, is Facebook and this collection of companies like more powerful than government? Well, it depends on the government, right? Like, for example, like if you take, I don't want to pick on Zimbabwe, but Zimbabwe had a go at having a currency and it didn't work out. And so they don't have one anymore, right? So, so Zimbabwe wasn't able to have a currency. And so, is Facebook and Libra more powerful than Zimbabwe? By this measure, they could be, right? They haven't launched it yet, the mainnet, but like, maybe they'll do better, right, than Zimbabwe, right? So I guess, the thing that's if you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin by some measures is larger than the Russian ruble, and I think it's the number 8 currency now in the planet. So so it's really interesting to start to see the effects of all of these things. But the thing that I think is kind of like an inevitable fact is that as you bring 2.5 billion users into the cryptographic asset space, that's probably going to have a beneficial effect on things like Bitcoin and Ethereum and all of the kind of children of Satoshi Nakamoto. So I think it's going to be there's going to be really interesting knock-on effects, and I think the net is really positive overall for open source money, because that just means more choices. And I think Facebook is actually going to be forced to compete for the consent of users and the consent of developers. And I think they've got a great head start because they got this muscular consortium that's really hard to kind of, there's no open source Uber, so there's a long way to go before like open source commoditizes everyone. But as long as those folks are adding value, like, great, like, let them compete for my consent, right? And I'll consent to stuff that serves me, and if it stops serving me the way I want, then I'll go somewhere else. So I'm pretty peaceful because I just feel like open source is relentless and it doesn't sleep and it always wins. So
we covered the Star Wars analogies here, but you've always been so strong on the Game of Thrones analogies. when winter went, you warned us winter was coming, and as a metaphor for the crypto markets. And then in the real world, Game of Thrones is over. Can you draw any comparisons there? Can you give us any Game of Thrones on the spot, putting you on the spot metaphors here?
Yeah. I like to say that people keep talking about Bitcoin, right? And to me, the reason they keep talking about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is sitting on the iron throne of cryptocurrency, and who knows if another coin, let's say Libra, could potentially like surpass Bitcoin as sitting on the iron throne, and if it does that, the question becomes like, well, what is that what is that throne worth, right? So, in my way of looking at it, the Iron Throne of cryptocurrency is really worth 50% of the value, the aggregate value of all the cryptocurrencies, right? Because that's all based on this supposition that there's going to be a power law distribution. So the question then becomes, does Libra get bigger than Bitcoin? And if it does, then what happens to Bitcoin, right? And the question is, how do those numbers settle out? So, to me, that's going to be pretty interesting. And, I think we're headed for, I guess I would say, a climactic battle, and, hopefully, like, some dragons and undead types flying out. I'm just looking forward to the show.
Someone's got to write a Medium post on drawing all the metaphors of who's Daenerys and who's Jon Snow and in this whole Libra, Bitcoin, and crypto space.
I think if you consult Tegan, like I think she's going with like Mark Zuckerberg is like the Night King. The king of the
I didn't say that. Your words, not mine. I guess I just want to, before we jump, I just want to like push on what Miko said about, leaving if you're dissatisfied. I feel like with Facebook, it's difficult to leave because it's almost like leaving society if you leave Facebook. And a lot of people do want to leave, but there's no alternative. So it's difficult.
I agree. It's a great point. I mean, hence like some of the like difficulty in us communicating to organize this gap, this connection where I'm trying to stay off of Facebook and both of you guys are on there. And like, yeah, I can't delete my entire Facebook account because my, employment status and all that stuff requires, and my sort of engagement with the world requires I'm in there.
Yep. It's almost become our identity in a way.
Yeah. There's so many places I want to go. I mean, even like the technical stuff we didn't really cover of, I think people who are listening of like, well, why isn't it a blockchain? Why isn't it decentralized? What do you mean? Like, that's fine. We could do a bunch of different, other conversations. Any final conclusions on this and what we should pay attention to?
To me, I think the highest order bit is that, in a way, I don't feel like the community should be afraid. Because in a way, like what's happening is the realization, right? We keep talking about things like mass adoption. We keep talking about like, wow, it'd really be nice if we had more than like 35 million wallets, and it's like, how does 2.5 billion wallets sound? Like, does that sound okay? It's like, we're really talking about, the emergence of an alternative financial system. Now, the thing that's really interesting is kind of like, what are the intentions of the contributors and all these kind of things. But like, my confidence in just studying the space is just to understand that, Facebook is not able to dominate open source. Like open source is going to dominate Facebook, so ultimately in the rules of that game, whoever serves people the most and wins the most consent is going to be the winner. And, it may take like 30 years and we may have to rebuild an open source version of Uber and an open source version of Visa. And, so we may have a lot of developer work to do, but, betting against developers has never been a particularly good bet.
Miko, give people a sense of just real quick who you are and if they'd like to get a hold of you or find out more about what you're up to, how they should do that.
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. You can just find me on Miko.com, Miko.com. Principally these days are focused on investing and venture capital. So I'm definitely excited about this open source money thesis and, investing into startups in this space in the early stage. But yeah, so just come check that out. I'm Miko Java on Twitter. And, I think everything's kind of jumping off from Miko.com. So you can just go there and have a look.
Perfect. And Tegan?
Yeah, so I'm Tegan Klein. I'm the Klein Venture on Twitter. It's probably easiest if you message me on Twitter. I'm pretty new to Twitter. And then just Tegan Klein on LinkedIn. I'm focused on opening up the internet for everyone everywhere through Orchid and also redistributing resources through Nature 2.0 at the convergence of AI and blockchain.
Coloring crypto.
Find Miko at miko.com, Miko.com.
Subscribe now.
And find Tegan at Twitter, The Klein Venture.
Subscribe now.
This is Coloring Crypto. I'm your host, Gabe Colors. Find everything you need at our website.
Which is probably the more sensible reaction, is to just instantly dismiss it and say that's obviously a lie, right?
My email is gabecolors@gmail.com. Our website is Coloring Crypto. And this whole thing started out, this episode particularly, because Tegan emailed me and said, or Facebooked me and said, let's get you, me, and Miko on a call to do an episode. And I think it's ironic that I am trying to get off Facebook. I've got strong biases against Facebook. I've got strong biases against Mark Zuckerberg's whole intent. And so it's weird to, feel okay, but I think in this modern digital age, where do we couch our uproar and our, desire for justice throughout and empowerment, against these massive corporations that own our data, that own us, and all these things. And, blockchain, one of the things I was most passionate about with blockchain was that it provided a possibility to replace Facebook, where I could be the owner of my data, and I could abandon Facebook. And as we discussed in this podcast today, I really can't abandon Facebook entirely if I want to be engaged in this world. So that's kind of weird, and Miko, I think, makes a lot of good points around, hey, if it's open source, it's open source. And so what I think maybe one of the bigger impacts is the usability, because a lot of the community and a lot of the people that would explain why, adoption for cryptocurrency and Bitcoin hasn't happened and why it's not a utility as much as it should be in our minds or imaginations. It's not just time, but the interfaces. I mean, there was that whole example with Zigzag, and they launched this journalism coin, and it took 50 steps to actually engage. I mean, people aren't going to do this until it's easy. So it's weird. It's a very, very, very weird but very important stage where Facebook is going into this crypto space. And, does it require decentralization? Because this is not exactly. Does it require, I think any outrage in this is fake, but I'm really looking forward to learning more and getting this dialogue going. And my last question, as I am passionately trying to explore podcasts and create my own non-fungible token, NFTs, ERC 721s, what's the implication here with that? Should I make my non-fungible coin on Facebook's platform? Hey, hit me at Gabe Colors on Twitter, email me, gabecolors@gmail.com, and thank you so much for listening.